Hi, let's just talk about shades of yellow as well while we're talking about shades. So having talked about olive green, yellow is another colour that fades quite nicely in the sun. Fun enough, so is red. That was another good choice for BR back in the 80s. All of these wagons here, let's just bring this up. So I've got a brill, I've got a tench, I've got another brill, and I've got a factory sea cow where I've taken the factory weathering off, and as you can see I've managed to leave some of it in place to leave this a slightly grubby vehicle. These are all painted in what should be rail yellow. Now I've got one of the relatively new Bachmann Wickham trolleys. Now that Wickham trolley is pretty much rail yellow. That's the colour that things would have been painted when they were shiny and new. If I put that down and then push these wagons around so that you can see the colours on them, you can see that none of them are quite that golden colour. There's a nice kind of warmth to rail yellow, although there were various shades of it. So pre-1984 it was a little bit more lemony, post-84 there were a couple of shades, so actually it's got orangier as time has gone on. And actually if I hold this up, that's that colour there. That's a patch of rail match rail yellow on this mixing palette. But these wagons, I paint them one at a time, so I mix the paint up every time I paint the wagon. I don't just break open a pot of rail match to paint these wagons. And to do that again I use Games Workshop colours. So in this case I'm using a base called Avaland Sunset. I'm using a golden yellow which is currently called Iriel yellow, that's with a Y, Y-R-I-E-L, yellow, but it used to be called golden yellow. And then just a white, so it's just plain white. So the layer is called White Scar, but the base paint is called ceramite white at the moment, but they're quite stark white colours. And those three colours in combination will give me pretty much every shade of yellow that I want. And again, let's mix up a colour just so we can see. So Avaland Sunset, although it looks quite dull on the lid, when you take it out, it's actually quite orangey. And it needs probably just about half as much of that golden yellow, just to, maybe a bit more, just to give it that golden tint. Now obviously that's a bit of a weird colour, so we need to bring that up. Do that. Let's just get some white in there. Just pick some white up out the pot. Stick that on. And that brings that colour down quite nicely towards rail yellow. If I put that down this end, you can see that it's definitely not as orangey as the colour underneath. But that's absolutely fine, because the colour that I'm aiming at is something that's been sat in the sun bleaching quite happily for a couple of years. The yellow actually doesn't fade as badly as some of the other colours, but eventually these wagons will go something that's just like off-white. If they're left to bleach, they'll just keep bleaching until they're almost white coloured. And at that stage the grey is a very, very, very light grey, the sort of colour that used to paint the underside of your aeroplanes when you were younger. What Bachmann have done with this sea cow is actually give us something that's already partially faded. They then of course covered it in their fantastic light brown weathering, which looked most odd. But actually their shade of grey is nowhere near as grey as that on the end of the wagon there. If I hold those up. So that is actually out of the rail match pot, and that is flint grey or freight grey, rail freight grey. So it's a lighter colour already, but the yellow, they've actually left the yellow reasonably rail yellow, which is a bit odd, because actually again with that faded colour on the bottom, this colour would be much closer to something on the side of this brill. It would be a much brighter yellow. You can see it there, so that is quite a faded shade. it's such a nice finish on the wagon in the first place. There's no demarcation line between the yellow and the grey that I'm not really prepared to give that a complete repaint. But I am tempted, if I get another one, to go at it and just redo that yellow so it looks as faded as the grey. And that's really all there is to it with fading. The reds are easier. Games Workshop do a range of red shades for all of their various factions and races. And actually there are some colours that you can use to simulate faded rail red, which is quite an orangey shade when it's first applied. But it fades to a pink colour. Now there's all sorts of things, and I'm going to reach into the pot and pull a couple of them out. So this is a colour called Squig Orange. Squig Orange is actually pretty good for showing a reasonably mid-faded rail red colour. So HEA hoppers, OCAs, anything that would have been painted rail red to start with will fade through Squig Orange towards a pinkish colour. And there is a fantastic colour in their range called Pink Horror. Now Pink Horror really is pink, and I'm not entirely sure that I'd want to paint a whole wagon that colour, although certain parts of an OCA, certainly in EWS days when it had not been repainted since the mid-80s, would be pretty close to this colour. The Pink Horror is really good. If you get a factory painted freight brown wagon, what people call bauxite, over time that colour will fade, and actually dry brushing Pink Horror over the top of that freight brown will give you that faded effect. It's quite difficult to do, and I've managed it on an O gauge wagon, but in 4mm I've yet to try it, but it definitely worked well in O gauge. So that factory finish colour, which was not quite right, I've definitely made it something close to a faded colour before I then started to pick planks out on the side of the van in all sorts of other shades. Doomball Brown is very good for replicating a slightly faded freight brown, and actual freight brown as well, and also late freight brown, which is a more chocolatey colour. And that's really the trick to the fading effects. I genuinely don't do a lot of airbrush weathering anymore. I only paint 1 or 2 wagons at a time, and it's just not worth the effort getting everything out just to do a couple of wagons. So something like this Dogfish, actually all that's done is just a faded colour, and the suggestion of the weathering on the underframe is just by painting that a lighter colour in the first place. Here I have actually used the Citadel washes, so I've painted the inside of that hopper chute with a light grey colour, and then I've just grabbed hold of a load of this wash on a big brush and dragged it down the sides, and you can see it's behaved differently. The enamel wash, when I painted it onto the side, tended to rush off into the crevices and corners, but this Citadel wash, and if I just, yeah, I think I can get away with putting some on the other side. This is a colour called Seraphim Sepia, but as far as we need to know, it's sepia. There is also a colour called Agrax Earthshade, and that's basically a brown mud colour. And then there's a Nuln oil that is basically black. So for this I want to show a bit of a rust colour, so I think the sepia tint will be better. What I'm going to do is I'm going to get hold of a fairly old brush, and I'm just going to pick that paint up. Now if I hold this up just so you can see it kind of sits, so it reminds me a little bit of thin soup rather than those washes. If I put it down though, you can see that it is quite a thin colour. When you paint it on, it tends to sit where you've left it. It doesn't want to run away into the corners. Now that's okay, but then what that's done is it's tinted the whole side, and as it dries it will actually settle around the rivets along the edge, so they will definitely stand out, but it'll also tint the whole of the chute. And actually that's not an effect I want to achieve, so before it's dried I'm going to get myself a flat brush, and I'm just going to get in there and I'm going to drag down the side and remove some of that to leave a slightly streakier effect. So I've just left a bit in the corners, which I don't really want in there. And what you end up with is that streaky effect, which is what you want with a ballast wagon. Any of these ballast wagons. So the Sea Cow is done in exactly the same way. Now that's been done a couple of times and it's been left to sit, so the whole thing is a slightly rusty tint over the dusty ballast colour. These chutes are usually actually painted either black or red oxide, and they go that grey colour which Bachmann produced them from the factory with, because they're covered in ballast dust. So all I'm doing with this wash is I'm reinstating some of that underlying colour, but also the streaky, watery rust that you get left behind when a load's been discharged. And that's that's a good use for these washes. So anything where you want the colour to cling across the whole surface, whereas with those enamel washes you want to get the wash to run into all the small details. So if I wanted to highlight all of the rivets on this Cambrian catfish, I would use probably a mid-brown wash, and I'd just ping it onto the model near the rivets and just let the capillary action and that thinners just suck it around the rivets and highlight all the rivets. And then maybe run it either side of the hopper uprights. Now I'm not too fussed about doing that, although I might do now I've said it, just to bring out some of that detail and make it look a little bit more used. It'll work well. If I use the Games Workshop washes, I'd wash it over the whole surface, and although it would sit on the details, it would tend to be quite large. In fact, if I go back to that 13 tonner, you can see that's exactly what's happened. So all of these areas of detail, this wash has actually sat in quite a large area around it. What I probably need to do is go back over this wagon and just dry brush over it to reduce the size of that ring around the detail, because it's slightly distracting and it looks more like a patch of rust than something that's designed to highlight the fact that there's rivets there. From normal viewing distance, probably looks okay, but when you get up close it kind of does look a bit odd. It's a little bit impressionistic, and that's the difference